Imagine living in a country where the signs that once read whites only are gone. Yet the same barriers still shape the opportunities you have, the neighborhoods you live in, and even the schools your children attend. You might think that segregation is a thing of the past, a chapter of history safely closed, but the truth is far more complicated. Structural racism still exists in modern America, not as obvious lines drawn in chalk or law books, but as subtle systems that quietly shape the way power, wealth, and opportunity are distributed. These systems are clever. They hide behind neutral language, policies that claim to be fair, and data that seems objective, all while producing the same unequal outcomes that Jim Crow once enforced openly. Take a moment to picture your community. Think about which neighborhoods are well-funded, which schools have advanced programs, and which streets are lined with modern amenities versus those with crumbling sidewalks and minimal public services. Now, ask yourself why these differences exist. They are not random. They are the results of decades of policies, zoning laws, and investment patterns that disproportionately favored some communities over others. Even when laws explicitly banning segregation were passed, these patterns persisted under new guises. What looks like local control of schools or colorblind housing policies can be a modern version of old inequities, maintaining the gaps between neighborhoods, resources, and lives. This story is not just about numbers or policies, it is about real people and their everyday experiences. It is about families struggling to access quality education, young adults navigating biased legal systems, and communities trying to build wealth while facing invisible obstacles. These challenges are often invisible to those who do not experience them firsthand, which is exactly why they persist. When systems operate quietly, inequality can become normalized, appearing as though it is simply the natural order of society. But it is not natural, it is constructed, maintained, and reinforced by choices made over generations. Understanding structural racism is essential because it shows that the fight for equality is not only about changing laws, but also about recognizing and dismantling the systems that produce unequal outcomes. From political representation and healthcare access to housing, education, and environmental safety, these hidden structures affect nearly every aspect of life. Awareness is the first step toward change. By seeing how these patterns operate today, we can challenge them and advocate for policies that truly promote fairness and opportunity for all. If you want to uncover the hidden ways history still shapes modern America and learn how these systems affect our daily lives, make sure to watch the full video. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an eye-opening story. Together, we can explore these truths, share knowledge, and take steps toward a more equitable future. As we delve deeper into the story of structural racism in modern America, it becomes clear that the laws which once openly justified segregation did not simply disappear, they transformed, adapting to the changing social and political landscape in ways that are often invisible at first glance. Imagine walking through a city where the boundaries that divide communities are not marked by fences or signs, but by policies, funding formulas, and legal interpretations that quietly determine who has access to opportunity and who does not. The doctrine of colorblind policy, for instance, seems fair on paper. It promises equality by treating everyone the same. Yet in practice, it often ignores the historical and structural disadvantages that continue to shape the lives of marginalized communities. By claiming not to see race, these policies effectively preserve the disparities that segregation once enforced openly. Consider the education system, where school funding is largely tied to local property taxes. On paper, every district receives resources proportional to its local contributions, which sounds neutral and reasonable. However, decades of housing discrimination, redlining, and economic segregation have concentrated wealth in predominantly white neighborhoods while systematically limiting investment in predominantly black communities. The local control of schools may sound empowering, but it creates a modern version of segregation. Students in one zip code have access to state-of-the-art facilities, advanced programs, and well-funded extracurricular activities, while those just a few miles away navigate overcrowded classrooms, outdated textbooks, and underpaid teachers. This is not a quirk of local governance. It is a direct descendant of the policies and legal rulings that once justified keeping black and white students separate. The law may insist that schools are integrated, but the resource gap ensures that the spirit of segregation remains embedded in the system. The echoes of these doctrines are felt in voting and political representation as well. Colorblind election policies may claim to treat every citizen equally, but practices like gerrymandering and the counting of incarcerated populations in rural districts distort the political voice of marginalized communities. What seems like a technical adjustment on a map is, in reality, a sophisticated continuation of historical tactics used to limit black political influence. District lines drawn under the guise of neutrality can amplify the power of one group while simultaneously silencing others, producing outcomes that feel detached from the communities they are supposed to serve. The law no longer explicitly forbids black citizens from voting, yet it still structures political power in ways that maintain long-standing disparities, proving that the form of justice has changed even when its effects remain similar. Policing and criminal justice, too, reflect this evolution. While segregation laws have been abolished, new legal interpretations and policies guide how enforcement is applied across different communities. Neutral laws, such as minor traffic or public safety regulations, can be applied disproportionately to communities of color, reproducing the patterns of control and exclusion established under Jim Crow. In a courtroom, seemingly race-neutral language allows prosecutors to shape juries in ways that disadvantage black defendants, echoing the all-white juries of the past. These are not anomalies or mistakes, they are the contemporary manifestations of a system that has been refined over generations to achieve the same unequal results without ever explicitly invoking race. Housing policy also demonstrates the subtle persistence of segregation. Zoning laws, development regulations, and lending practices all operate under principles that appear neutral. Yet they reinforce historical patterns of exclusion. Low-income and predominantly black neighborhoods are often the last to receive infrastructure investments or are targeted for undesirable developments like industrial plants, perpetuating environmental hazards and economic disadvantages. Wealthier, predominantly white areas, in contrast, continue to accumulate benefits from decades of investment, creating a feedback loop where privilege begets more privilege and disadvantage compounds over time. The law may not say black families cannot live here, but the outcome often mirrors what segregation once enforced openly, proving that neutrality can mask inequality. Even in healthcare, colorblind funding formulas and reimbursement practices replicate disparities that were codified under segregation. Hospitals in wealthier, largely white neighborhoods receive more resources and attract higher quality staff, while facilities serving marginalized communities operate with fewer resources and under greater strain. Studies show that patients of color often receive delayed or insufficient treatment, a pattern rooted not in contemporary prejudice alone, but in a historical system that systematically underfunded and devalued their communities. The logic behind neutral policies assuming fairness comes from equal treatment without considering unequal starting points allows inequities to persist, much like the separate but equal doctrine once did. As we trace the evolution of these legal doctrines, it becomes apparent that the law itself can be both a shield and a tool. It shields the inequities from scrutiny by hiding them behind seemingly impartial language, and it acts as a tool to enforce long-standing disparities under a veneer of fairness. The transformation from overt segregation to colorblind policy and local control represents not a solution but a sophisticated adaptation, ensuring that systemic racism continues to shape access to education. political power, housing, policing, and healthcare. Understanding this evolution is crucial because it reminds us that the fight for equality cannot be limited to repealing explicit laws or abolishing overtly discriminatory practices. The challenge lies in recognizing the ways structural inequities are embedded within the very frameworks that are designed to appear neutral. True equity requires examining outcomes, uncovering hidden biases, and addressing the historical context that gave rise to modern disparities. Only by connecting the dots between past and present can we begin to dismantle a system that has been meticulously engineered to reproduce inequality across generations. As we continue this journey, we must remain vigilant in asking how policies that claim neutrality may still perpetuate the legacy of Jim Crow, and how understanding these hidden mechanisms empowers communities to advocate for real, measurable change. By exploring these legal doctrines and their modern consequences, we uncover a story of continuity rather than rupture, showing that the law's evolution often masks, rather than resolves, the challenges faced by marginalized communities across America. As we explore the many ways structural racism has adapted and persisted in modern America, one of the most striking examples lies not in overt laws or signage, but in the quiet mechanics of political power, where the presence of incarcerated individuals is used to reshape representation in ways that profoundly impact communities of color. Imagine a small rural town in America, picturesque on the surface, yet strategically positioned with a large prison complex. Within those walls are thousands of people, disproportionately black, drawn from cities and neighborhoods far away. By law, when districts are drawn for legislative representation, these incarcerated individuals are counted as residents of the rural district where the prison sits. Even though they cannot vote, do not participate in local civic life, and have no real connection to that community. On paper, this seems like a procedural quirk, a technical detail in the census that ensures population equality. In reality, it is a mechanism that inflates the political power of already dominant groups while silencing the very people whose lives are being measured. Much like the legal structures and policies we have already seen, where neutral rules reproduce inequity under the guise of fairness. This practice, known as prison gerrymandering, is more than a statistical oddity. It is a contemporary echo of the strategies once used during the Jim Crow era to suppress black political influence. Following the end of Reconstruction, Southern states sought to minimize the political power of black citizens. Felon disenfranchisement laws, mass arrests for minor infractions, and the counting of enslaved or marginalized populations for representation without granting them the vote were all calculated moves to engineer political advantage for white majorities. Today, the system has been refined, disguised in spreadsheets and census counts, yet the underlying logic remains the same. The bodies of marginalized people are used to amplify the influence of those already in power, while denying those individuals a voice in determining their own future. The rural legislator, whose district owes much of its population count to incarcerated residents, gains disproportionate influence in state decisions, including policies that affect education, healthcare, and criminal justice policies that often further disadvantage the very communities from which these prisoners came. Consider the real-world consequences. Neighborhoods in urban areas, primarily populated by black and brown residents, lose political clout as their residents are incarcerated and counted elsewhere. The policies that shape local schools, housing developments, policing priorities, and community investments are made by representatives who have never lived there and do not face the everyday consequences of their decisions. Meanwhile, the incarcerated individuals themselves have no voice in the political process. They cannot vote, they cannot influence who sits on the city council or state legislature, and their needs are largely invisible in the decisions that shape their communities. The system, though cloaked in legality, perpetuates the same cycle of exclusion and control that Jim Crow once enforced openly, reinforcing disparities that ripple across generations. The impact of prison gerrymandering extends beyond mere representation. Because the political strength of districts can depend on the number of incarcerated people within them, there is an inherent incentive to maintain or even expand prison populations. This creates a feedback loop where mass incarceration is not only tolerated but indirectly rewarded, entrenching systems that disproportionately target black communities through policing, sentencing, and economic enforcement. The mechanics are subtle but devastating. A system that appears neutral on paper systematically advantages some groups while maintaining the subordination of others, echoing the themes we have already traced in education, housing, and healthcare. To fully grasp the magnitude of this phenomenon, imagine a single family in a city neighborhood where several members are incarcerated. Their absence not only diminishes the neighborhood's political voice, but also concentrates legislative power in a district that has little connection to their lived reality. Decisions about funding for schools, allocation of resources for public services, and law enforcement priorities are influenced by representatives whose constituents are largely unaffected by the issues facing these urban families. The incarcerated individuals experiences overcrowded facilities, limited access to rehabilitation, and systemic neglect have no bearing on the policies that affect their lives. Yet their very presence continues to be leveraged as a tool of representation elsewhere. This is not a relic of a distant past. It is an ongoing structure that shapes contemporary American democracy. In states across the country, reforms have begun to address this imbalance, with some jurisdictions adjusting how prisoners are counted for redistricting purposes. However, the practice persists in many areas, demonstrating how the legacy of Jim Crow continues to evolve. Subtly embedded within systems that claim to be colorblind or fair, the law allows this counting because it is framed as a neutral population measure. Yet the impact is profoundly unequal, illustrating how policies that seem technical or apolitical can perpetuate deep structural disparities. Prison gerrymandering serves as a stark reminder that equality under the law is not merely a matter of formal statutes. It is also about the underlying structures and incentives that shape who has power and who is rendered invisible, just as we have seen in the education system, housing policies, and healthcare funding. Neutral rules applied in unequal contexts produce unequal outcomes. The incarcerated population becomes an instrument of political leverage, reinforcing the systemic disadvantages that continue to define life for marginalized communities. By connecting these dots, we see a pattern, whether through local control, property-based school funding, jury selection, or prison counting. The logic is consistent. Systems that claim neutrality can still replicate the inequalities of the past. Understanding this mechanism is crucial not only for recognizing the ongoing legacy of segregation, but also for empowering communities to advocate for meaningful change. Awareness of prison gerrymandering reveals how deeply intertwined policy, law, and racial inequity are, and it challenges the notion that contemporary systems are fair simply because they appear neutral. The story of political representation, like the story of education, healthcare, and housing, is a story of continuity, adaptation, and the persistent need to confront inequities that are both hidden and systemic. By examining these structures, we uncover the ways in which history continues to shape the present, highlighting the urgent need for reforms that truly reflect the principles of equality and justice. As we follow the thread connecting modern structural inequities to the legacies of Jim Crow, the courtroom emerges as a critical arena where historical patterns of exclusion continue to play out with profound consequences. Picture a jury box in a small-town courthouse somewhere in America. On the surface, it is a neutral space designed to reflect the community and deliver impartial justice. 12 citizens, randomly drawn, are meant to stand between the accused and the state, ensuring that verdicts are fair and representative. But the reality often diverges sharply from this ideal, particularly for black defendants whose fate is being determined by a process that has been carefully engineered to limit their voices and perspectives. Prosecutors, armed with the legal right to strike potential jurors without providing explicit racial reasons, have mastered a subtle yet powerful art. They exclude black jurors under race-neutral justifications such as body language, prior experiences, or perceived attitudes, a practice that mirrors the exclusionary jury selection tactics used during Jim Crow, only now cloaked in the language of legality and fairness. Take the case of Curtis Flowers in Mississippi, a man tried 6 times for the same crime over more than 2 decades, as an illustrative example of how deeply this issue runs. In each trial, prosecutors systematically removed black jurors from consideration using pretexts that appeared neutral on paper, but had the unmistakable effect of creating juries overwhelmingly white, and therefore far less likely to empathize with or fairly consider the perspectives of the black defendant. Reasons offered were seemingly innocuous. A juror knew the victim's family, expressed uncertainty about the death penalty, or even wore sunglasses in court. Yet behind these ostensibly neutral explanations lay a deliberate strategy to skew the composition of the jury, demonstrating that the law's veneer of fairness can conceal deeply unequal outcomes. The result was predictable: verdicts that disproportionately disadvantaged the defendant and reinforced racial hierarchies long embedded in the justice system. The courtroom is not an isolated space in this story. It is connected to the broader mechanisms of power that we have already examined. Just as the political influence of black communities can be diminished through prison gerrymandering, and access to education and healthcare constrained by historically rooted funding formulas, the exclusion of black jurors functions as another point where structural inequities are maintained under the guise of neutrality. The logic is consistent. Systems that appear impartial on paper can be manipulated to produce outcomes that mirror the inequalities of the past. In each instance, the language of the law race-neutral. Objective. Procedural serves as a shield, allowing practices that perpetuate disadvantage to continue largely unchecked. What makes this form of exclusion particularly insidious is its subtlety. Unlike the overt segregation of Jim Crow, modern jury manipulation operates in the shadows of legal standards designed to prevent explicit discrimination. Batson v. Kentucky in 1986 prohibited the exclusion of jurors solely on the basis of race. Yet the enforcement mechanism allows prosecutors to justify their strikes with any neutral reason. No matter how tenuous, courts rarely dig beyond the surface, and the impact is profound. Black citizens are repeatedly denied the opportunity to participate in a fundamental aspect of democracy: the right to serve on a jury, while defendants from their own communities face juries that do not reflect their peers or lived experiences. The system, in essence, retains the power dynamics of Jim Crow without ever stating it openly, proving once again that neutrality on paper does not guarantee equality in practice. The human consequences of these practices ripple far beyond the courtroom. Consider the psychological toll on defendants who face repeated trials before juries that may be predisposed by composition to deliver harsher sentences. The erosion of trust in the legal system among marginalized communities, and the reinforcement of social hierarchies that limit opportunities for upward mobility. These outcomes are interconnected with the other systemic inequities we have explored: educational disparities that limit access to legal knowledge, political underrepresentation that reduces accountability, and economic disenfranchisement that constrains resources for defense. The courtroom becomes a microcosm where historical injustices intersect with contemporary policy, demonstrating that the legacy of Jim Crow is neither distant nor abstract. It is lived, experienced, and perpetuated through carefully maintained structures. Moreover, the exclusion of black jurors underscores a broader principle that runs throughout these systemic inequities: the difference between intent and impact. Modern policies often hide behind race-neutral language and procedural justification, creating the appearance of fairness. yet the impact disproportionately harms marginalized communities. Whether through prison gerrymandering, school funding inequities, or health disparities, the outcomes consistently reflect a society in which historical power imbalances continue to shape access. Representation and opportunity. In the courtroom, the stakes are immediate and tangible. Verdicts determine freedom or confinement, the trajectory of families and communities, and the perception of justice itself. By manipulating jury composition while adhering to the letter of the law, the system ensures that these outcomes continue to reflect long-standing inequities, illustrating the adaptability of structural racism over time. Understanding this dynamic is essential for anyone seeking to comprehend how historical injustices persist in contemporary society. The courtroom is not merely a place where legal principles are applied. It is a site where the interplay of law, policy, and power is most starkly visible. By tracing how race-neutral justifications are used to exclude black jurors, we can see the continuity between Jim Crow-era practices and modern judicial strategies, revealing a pattern that extends across multiple domains of life. This recognition challenges the assumption that legal equality alone is sufficient to produce social justice and emphasizes the need to examine both procedures and outcomes when assessing fairness. In connecting this story to the broader themes of structural inequity, it becomes evident that exclusion, whether in politics, education, housing, healthcare, or the courtroom, is rarely accidental. It is the product of deeply embedded systems that have evolved to maintain the same hierarchies under new guises. By understanding how prosecutors continue to manipulate jury composition using ostensibly neutral methods, we gain insight into the adaptability and resilience of these systems, as well as the profound work required to address them. The courtroom, in this sense, becomes a lens through which we can understand the broader narrative of persistent racial inequity, a narrative in which the past and present are inextricably linked, and where the fight for genuine fairness continues to unfold in both visible and hidden ways. As we continue to trace the threads of structural inequity across modern America, the story of everyday interactions with the law reveals how deeply the legacy of Jim Crow persists in seemingly routine events, particularly in the realm of traffic enforcement. On the surface, a traffic stop might appear mundane, a brief encounter at a red light, a citation for a minor infraction, but for many black drivers, these encounters are anything but ordinary, functioning instead as an entry point into a far-reaching system of control and disenfranchisement. Consider the experience of a young black man commuting through a city where law enforcement patrol patterns are heavily influenced by historical assumptions about race and neighborhood demographics. He might be driving to work, attending school, or visiting family, yet because of where he lives and the type of vehicle he drives, he becomes disproportionately likely to be pulled over, questioned, and cited. Unlike the randomness implied by the law, the reality is that these stops are deeply patterned, reflecting a sophisticated system of selective enforcement that mirrors the old Jim Crow logic, now operating under the guise of neutrality. The mechanisms of this system are subtle but pervasive. Under Jim, police employed vagrancy laws, loitering ordinances, and disturbing the peace statutes to target black individuals at will, creating an environment in which arbitrary enforcement maintained social hierarchies. Today, the laws themselves may have changed, but the outcomes remain eerily similar. Minor infractions, expired registrations, broken taillights, or even alleged equipment violations serve as pretexts for officers to engage individuals who are statistically more likely to be black. These stops often escalate: a missed payment on a fine or a suspended license, perhaps the result of earlier traffic tickets, can lead to misdemeanor or felony charges, generating a cascading set of legal obligations that disproportionately entangle black drivers. What seems like routine enforcement in isolation is, in aggregate, a methodical funneling into the criminal justice system. echoing the control mechanisms of Jim Crow street enforcement without overtly mentioning race. The implications extend far beyond the initial stop. Each interaction carries the potential for arrest, court fees, and further legal complications, creating a system where marginalized individuals can be ensnared for actions that would rarely affect more privileged drivers in the same way. The cumulative impact on families, employment, and community stability is profound. Missing work to attend court, the financial strain of paying fines or legal fees, and the emotional toll of repeated encounters with law enforcement reinforce patterns of disadvantage that ripple across generations. Moreover, the neighborhoods in which these drivers live are not incidental. They are the product of decades of discriminatory housing policies, redlining, and economic disinvestment, meaning that the risk of traffic enforcement is tightly linked to historical patterns of segregation. In this way, the seemingly neutral administration of law functions as a contemporary instrument of control, maintaining inequities that have been embedded in social and legal systems for more than a century. Consider a practical scenario: a black family living in an urban area where policing is concentrated in certain neighborhoods due to historical zoning and crime statistics. The parents drive children to school, commute to work, or run errands, only to find that minor infractions, which might be overlooked in wealthier, predominantly white neighborhoods, are treated with rigor in their community. Each citation can set off a chain reaction. Court appearances, fines, and in some cases, additional penalties such as suspended licenses. Driving without a valid license, often a consequence of this cycle, can result in arrest, criminal records, and, for some, imprisonment. Once again, the logic echoes Jim Crow strategies, where minor infractions were exploited to criminalize black bodies, limiting mobility and reinforcing structural hierarchies. The law may not openly discriminate, but the impact does, shaping the life trajectories of countless individuals and families. The scale of this practice magnifies its consequences. Data consistently show that black drivers are disproportionately stopped, searched, and arrested compared to white drivers for the same infractions, underscoring that the racial dimension is not incidental but systemic. Law enforcement may describe these actions as neutral policy enforcement, yet the racialized outcomes reveal a pattern that reproduces historical inequities. Just as property taxes continue to shape school funding and prison counts inflate political power, minor traffic violations serve as a contemporary lever for maintaining social hierarchies. The seemingly routine interaction of a traffic stop is, in effect, a gateway to a broader web of systemic disadvantages, where individuals are drawn into legal, economic, and social vulnerability through mechanisms that appear impartial but operate with predictable inequity. What is particularly striking about this phenomenon is the way it intersects with other systemic issues. The consequences of traffic enforcement feed into patterns of incarceration that then influence political representation through prison gerrymandering. They contribute to economic instability by diverting family resources to fines and legal costs. And they shape community perceptions of justice and fairness, fostering distrust in institutions that are supposed to protect rather than control. The system operates with remarkable efficiency. Under veneer of neutral laws, historical patterns of racial control are reproduced in ways that are difficult to challenge, because they are codified within standard procedures. Ultimately, minor traffic violations are not minor in their impact. They function as an entry point into a legal and social system that disproportionately affects Black Americans, sustaining cycles of disadvantage that echo the strategies of Jim Crow. By examining these practices in the context of broader structural inequities spanning political representation, jury selection, education, and housing, we see a continuum of systemic mechanisms designed to limit access, constrain opportunity, and perpetuate disparities. The traffic stop, then, becomes emblematic of the subtle yet profound ways structural racism continues to shape daily life, demonstrating that the legacy of segregation is not confined to the past but remains embedded in the laws, policies, and practices of the present. As the story of structural inequity unfolds, the issue of land ownership emerges as a stark illustration of how historical policies continue to shape the distribution of wealth and power in modern America. Imagine a sprawling family farm in the rural South, passed down through generations, a symbol not just of property but of heritage, resilience, and community. This farm, perhaps started by ancestors who survived the brutalities of slavery and fought to carve out a life under Jim Crow, should have been a source of stability and opportunity. Yet, beneath the surface, a quiet legal threat has been eroding that foundation for decades. The complexities of heirs property and the loopholes embedded in inheritance law that disproportionately affect black families. Unlike the overt violence and theft of the past, this is a subtler mechanism, one disguised as a neutral application of property law, yet its consequences echo the historical expropriations that once defined American racial inequity. Heirs property arises when land is passed down informally, without clear titles, often because family members were barred from accessing legal resources or discriminated against in financial and governmental systems. Over time, multiple descendants inherit fractional interests, creating a web of ownership that is both legally complex and highly vulnerable. Any single co-owner, even a distant relative who may never have set foot on the land, has the legal right to force a partition sale. This process frequently results in the land being sold to outside investors, who often exploit the situation for profit, stripping the family of property, wealth, and legacy in one swift action. The emotional impact is profound. A family farm that has survived generations can vanish virtually overnight, its history erased and its economic potential redirected. This is not a rare occurrence. Since 1910, black farmers have lost roughly 90% of their farmland, much of it through such legal maneuvers. The implications extend far beyond individual families, affecting communities. Political representation, and access to resources. Because land is not merely property, it is a foundation for wealth, education, and civic influence. Consider the lived experience of a contemporary family attempting to maintain their inherited land. The grandmother may have nurtured the fields. The grandfather may have instilled a love of cultivation and stewardship. And the parents may have continued that tradition, hoping to pass it to their children. Yet, one relative, perhaps unaware of the farmer's significance or lured by immediate financial gain, might initiate a petition sale. Even if the majority of the family opposes the sale, the court may approve it, prioritizing the legal rights of the few over the collective heritage. This process converts generational wealth into an immediate windfall for outsiders, who may redevelop the land into luxury housing or commercial projects, completely displacing the original community. The narrative of progress, then, is intertwined with the systematic dispossession of black families, a pattern that reproduces the economic inequities embedded in centuries of discriminatory practices. The historical continuity here is striking. Under Jim, laws were overtly designed to limit black wealth accumulation, from restricting access to loans and credit to segregating communities and undervaluing property in black neighborhoods. Heirs property disputes may not carry the explicit racial markers of these earlier laws, but the outcomes are painfully familiar. Black families are disenfranchised from the economic power that land provides, and wealth is systematically shifted into the hands of outsiders, often white investors or developers. This legal framework is another example of structural inequity operating under a veneer of neutrality, where the formal law appears colorblind, yet the effects reproduce long-standing racial hierarchies. Just as prison gerrymandering amplifies political influence for white voters, or traffic enforcement funnels black citizens into the criminal justice system, the heirs property loophole ensures that wealth, influence, and stability continue to flow away from historically marginalized communities. Moreover, the consequences are not limited to economics. Land carries social, cultural, and political significance. Farms and homesteads serve as centers for community life, spaces where traditions are maintained and passed down, and where families cultivate not only crops but also social cohesion and political engagement. The loss of these lands undermines community stability, diminishes intergenerational knowledge, and erodes the political power that comes from sustained residency and property ownership. For example, when black families lose farmland through heirs' property sales, they may also lose influence in local decision-making, their ability to advocate for community resources, or their capacity to shape zoning and development policies. Wealth transfer through legal loopholes thus becomes a tool for maintaining systemic inequalities, echoing the broader narrative of historical displacement. Disenfranchisement and exploitation. The story of heirs' property is intertwined with other domains we have explored, just as disparities in school funding, political representation, jury selection, and law enforcement outcomes perpetuate inequity. Land loss sustains and magnifies these disadvantages. Without property, families struggle to secure loans for education, start businesses, or invest in health and housing, reinforcing cycles of poverty and limiting opportunities for social mobility. This convergence of factors illustrates that structural racism is not a series of isolated incidents but a complex, interconnected web in which economic, political, and legal mechanisms operate simultaneously to maintain unequal outcomes. Efforts to mitigate this inequity, such as the Uniform Partition of Heirs' Property Act adopted in some states, offer hope, allowing families the right of first refusal and requiring court-ordered appraisals before a sale. However, the uneven adoption of these measures means that many black families remain vulnerable, and the broader patterns of dispossession continue unabated, without widespread legal reform. Financial support and awareness of these systemic dynamics, the cycle of land loss will persist, reinforcing disparities that stretch back generations. Ultimately, the story of heirs' property illuminates a critical aspect of structural inequity: the ability of ostensibly neutral laws to reproduce historical patterns of exclusion and dispossession. By tracing this issue alongside the political manipulation of prison accounts, the exclusion of black jurors, and the disproportionate targeting of black drivers, we see a pattern emerge, a continuum of control and disenfranchisement that adapts to changing legal and social contexts while maintaining the same underlying power dynamics. The loss of black farmland through legal loopholes is not simply an economic issue. It is a window into the broader story of systemic inequity, demonstrating how history, law, and policy intersect to shape the lived realities of communities across America, reminding us that the struggle for equity extends far beyond the visible markers of discrimination and into the structures that govern opportunity, wealth, and survival. In our exploration of structural inequity, one of the most insidious and often overlooked mechanisms is the denial of linguistic access in the legal system, a barrier that continues to echo the oppressive strategies of the Jim Crow era, where literacy tests were used to systematically disenfranchise black citizens and prevent them from participating fully in society. Imagine walking into a courtroom, the air thick with the weight of authority and expectation, only to realize that the proceedings are being conducted in a language you cannot fully comprehend. For countless non-English speakers in America, this scenario is not hypothetical, it is a daily reality, a quiet but powerful method of exclusion that mirrors the logic of the past, ensuring that access to justice is conditional on one's ability to navigate the language of power. These individuals, many of whom are immigrants, refugees, or members of marginalized communities, face a legal system where understanding the language is not merely a convenience, but the difference between safeguarding one's rights or being swept into a cycle of vulnerability. The parallels to Jim Crow are striking. During that era, states implemented understanding clauses and literacy tests, ostensibly neutral requirements that, in practice, were designed to prevent black citizens from voting. Success depended not on ability or fairness, but on the discretion of registrars who could interpret answers subjectively, often failing applicants arbitrarily to maintain racial hierarchies. Today, while the explicit racial criteria are absent, the effect is remarkably similar. The lack of qualified interpreters or access to translation services functions as a gatekeeping mechanism, restricting participation in the legal process and denying fair representation. Defendants may face court hearings, housing disputes, immigration proceedings, or even criminal trials without fully understanding the charges, the evidence, or the nuances of the law. In this context, the system maintains the veneer of legality and neutrality while continuing to impose disproportionate disadvantages on vulnerable populations, ensuring outcomes that reinforce existing inequities. Consider the experience of a non-English-speaking parent navigating the family court system. They arrive for a hearing concerning custody or child support, anxious and reliant on procedural fairness. Yet, without a competent interpreter, they may misinterpret critical instructions, fail to respond appropriately to legal questions, or miss key deadlines. Every misstep is magnified, resulting in judgments that could strip them of parental rights, impose financial penalties, or lead to further legal complications. The stakes are enormous, and the consequences ripple outward to affect the entire family unit. This is not an isolated problem. Nationwide, courts often lack the resources to provide professional interpreters, relying instead on ad hoc arrangements or untrained individuals, sometimes even family members, who may lack objectivity or legal comprehension. The result is a system that systematically disadvantages those who cannot speak the dominant language, echoing the functional outcomes of Jim Crow's literacy tests while presenting itself as procedurally neutral. The impact extends beyond criminal or family law. Immigrant communities face additional vulnerabilities in immigration courts, where detention decisions, asylum applications, and deportation proceedings hinge on the ability to understand complex legal arguments. For someone unable to access proper interpretation, the ability to articulate claims, provide evidence, or challenge legal determinations is severely constrained. Housing disputes are similarly affected. Tenants with limited English proficiency may not understand eviction notices or fail to comply with court procedures simply because they cannot navigate the system linguistically. Domestic violence survivors face the same peril. Without adequate interpretation, they may be unable to convey threats or abuse effectively, leaving them exposed to continued harm. The common thread in these scenarios is clear. Language access is not merely a service. It is a critical safeguard against systemic inequity, and its absence reproduces the exclusionary logic of past discriminatory practices. The consequences of this linguistic barrier are compounded by the administrative structures and priorities of the courts themselves. Providing professional interpreters incurs costs and requires logistical coordination, and many jurisdictions, citing budgetary constraints, limit the availability of these services. The official explanation emphasizes efficiency and resource management. Yet the practical effect is a system that systematically disadvantages those least able to navigate independently. Just as literacy tests during Jim Crow were justified under the guise of civic competence, modern courts often justify limited interpretation services as practical necessity, masking a structural inequity behind procedural rationales. The result is that marginalized communities bear the brunt of legal outcomes they are ill-equipped to influence, perpetuating cycles of vulnerability and exclusion that intersect with broader patterns of social and economic disadvantage. This dynamic also interacts with other aspects of structural inequity we have examined. Consider families who have already been affected by the loss of property through heirs' property disputes, or individuals funneled into the criminal justice system through disproportionate traffic stops or biased jury selection. The lack of language access compounds these disadvantages, creating layers of systemic obstacles that are difficult to unravel. A person who cannot fully participate in their own legal defense is far more likely to face adverse outcomes. Reinforcing economic, social, and political disparities. The pattern is consistent, whether through political manipulation, property law, criminal justice, or education. The law often presents as neutral while outcomes remain predictably inequitable, demonstrating the persistence of structural barriers that echo the Jim Crow era in modern forms. Real-life stories illuminate the stakes. In Moise, a recently arrived immigrant faced an eviction proceeding in a court that provided no professional interpreter. Misunderstanding the court's instructions, they failed to submit a timely defense, and the family lost their home. In another, a non-English speaking defendant in a criminal trial could not effectively challenge evidence or communicate with counsel, leading to an unjust sentence that might have been avoided with proper interpretation. These instances are not anomalies. They exemplify systemic patterns where language barriers translate directly into legal vulnerability, echoing historical exclusionary practices that were once codified explicitly in law. Ultimately, the lack of interpreters for non-English speakers is not simply a logistical failure, it is a continuation of a centuries-old strategy of exclusion, repackaged to appear neutral while producing outcomes that reinforce inequity. It demonstrates how structural discrimination adapts to new contexts, maintaining control over marginalized populations under the guise of procedural fairness. When we recognize this, we see the importance of comprehensive language access as not merely a civil service, but a fundamental component of justice, equality, and participation. It is a reminder that the legacies of Jim Crow persist not only in overt laws, but in subtle mechanisms embedded in modern institutions, shaping outcomes and limiting opportunities for those who cannot navigate the system in its dominant language. As our exploration of structural inequity deepens, the focus shifts from courts and law enforcement to one of the most vital arenas of human life: healthcare. Imagine walking into a hospital in a black community, a facility that, on the surface, resembles any other hospital in America, with bustling nurses, doctors moving between rooms, and the quiet hum of medical equipment. Yet beneath the surface, the realities of systemic inequity are immediately apparent. These hospitals are chronically underfunded, relying on lower reimbursement rates from Medicaid, struggling to maintain essential staff, and often lacking advanced medical technology. The consequences are stark. Patients experience longer wait times, fewer treatment options, and overburdened medical personnel who, despite their dedication, cannot provide the same level of care found in wealthier, predominantly white neighborhoods. This funding disparity is not accidental. It is the financial residue of a history that has long associated race with worth, determining where resources flow and where they are withheld. Consider the lived experience of a black patient entering this underfunded hospital during a medical emergency. The initial triage may be delayed, diagnostic equipment may be outdated, and specialists may be unavailable. Every decision is influenced not solely by medical necessity, but by the resource constraints that result from decades of discriminatory funding practices. Studies have consistently demonstrated that black patients are less likely to receive pain medication, more likely to have their symptoms underestimated, and less likely to be referred to specialists compared to white patients with the same conditions. These disparities are not rooted in biology or patient behavior, but in systemic patterns of underinvestment and bias that persist in hospitals serving marginalized communities. The COVID-19 pandemic starkly exposed these inequalities. Black Americans were hospitalized and died at disproportionately high rates, not because of inherent vulnerability, but because they were more likely to live in medically underserved areas. hold frontline jobs with high exposure risk, and face barriers to consistent healthcare access. The echoes of Jim Crow are unmistakable. Just as segregated schools were underfunded to maintain racial hierarchies, and as zoning laws historically determined which communities received infrastructure and services, healthcare access has long been shaped by the same forces. Separate but unequal hospitals may no longer bear explicit signs or operate under formal segregation laws. But the structural inequities remain. The funding formulas themselves, tied to wealthier patient bases and local tax structures, perpetuate inequality in ways that appear neutral on paper. Hospitals in affluent areas with predominantly white populations receive more revenue through higher insurance reimbursements and larger philanthropic contributions, while hospitals serving Black and marginalized communities are left to navigate chronic shortages, staffing challenges, and aging facilities. This creates a cycle in which poor health outcomes become predictable and preventable deaths persist, reinforcing the inequities embedded in the system. Real-life stories illustrate the human toll of these structural disparities. Consider a mother with chronic health issues who relies on her local hospital for regular care. She faces long waits for appointments, limited availability of specialists, and delayed access to essential medications. Her conditions, which could be managed effectively in a well-resourced hospital, worsened due to systemic shortcomings. During the pandemic, similar stories multiplied across the country. Patients arriving at underfunded hospitals were often forced to wait longer for testing, treatment, or intensive care, directly contributing to preventable complications and deaths. These experiences are compounded when intersecting with language barriers, transportation challenges, or economic constraints, creating a multi-layered disadvantage that mirrors the structural disenfranchisement we have seen in political, legal, and educational systems. Beyond the individual, the consequences of underfunded hospitals ripple across entire communities. Access to quality healthcare affects educational outcomes, economic stability, and overall community resilience. Children growing up in neighborhoods with under-resourced hospitals may face delayed treatment for chronic conditions, impacting their school attendance and academic performance. Adults managing preventable or manageable conditions may struggle to maintain steady employment, affecting household income and generational wealth accumulation. In this way, the inequities in healthcare intersect with the broader structural disparities we have examined. Disenfranchisement in voting, biased jury selection, targeted policing, and land loss all compound the disadvantages of communities whose residents are systematically denied adequate medical care. The pattern is clear. Systemic inequities are not isolated events but interconnected mechanisms that collectively reinforce historical racial hierarchies. The problem is further compounded by implicit bias within medical culture. Healthcare professionals, even when well-intentioned, may unconsciously deprioritize Black patients, underestimate their symptoms, or make assumptions about compliance and risk factors based on race. These biases have real consequences, influencing diagnosis, treatment options, and survival outcomes. During crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic, these disparities became impossible to ignore. Higher rates of infection, hospitalization, and mortality in Black communities reflected not genetic predisposition but structural inequities. Economic vulnerability, and systemic bias in care delivery. Efforts to address these disparities through policy reforms, community health initiatives, and diversity training are critical. But the entrenched nature of structural inequity means that progress is slow and uneven, requiring sustained attention and systemic change. The story of healthcare inequity in Black communities is inseparable from the broader narrative we have explored. The ways in which systemic forces, legal, political, economic, and social, have been designed, adapted, and refined to maintain disadvantage for marginalized populations. Underfunded hospitals and biased treatment are not anomalies. They are predictable outcomes of historical policies and contemporary practices that continue to devalue Black lives. The consequences are profound. Preventable suffering. Diminished opportunity, and generational health disparities that intersect with the economic and social inequities created by land dispossession. Biased policing, jury manipulation, and linguistic barriers in the legal system. By examining these connections, we gain a clearer understanding of how structural racism operates across multiple domains, influencing every aspect of daily life and shaping the trajectory of entire communities. Ultimately, the inequities in healthcare remind us that structural racism is not confined to overt acts of discrimination, but is embedded in the very institutions that define access, opportunity, and survival. Addressing these disparities requires more than individual awareness. It demands systemic reform, equitable funding mechanisms, and intentional interventions that prioritize historically marginalized communities. It is only by recognizing the interconnectedness of these structural inequities across political, legal, economic, and healthcare systems that we can begin to dismantle the legacies of Jim Crow and move toward a society in which access to life-saving care is not a privilege but guaranteed right. As we continue to trace the lingering fingerprints of structural inequity in modern America, the conversation naturally extends from healthcare to the very environments in which people live, work, and raise their families. Imagine a neighborhood that, from the outside, seems ordinary: tree-lined streets, small businesses, and modest homes, but beneath this veneer lies a hidden reality, one that disproportionately affects historically Black communities: a concentration of hazardous industries, waste facilities, oil refineries, and chemical plants. These are not randomly placed. They follow a pattern shaped over decades, rooted in discriminatory zoning practices, redlining, and the systemic undervaluing of Black neighborhoods. Land was historically cheaper in these areas not by accident, but as a result of intentional policies that depressed property values, restricted investment, and limited the ability of residents to accumulate wealth. The consequences are profound, creating environments where exposure to pollution, toxic substances, and industrial hazards is a daily, unavoidable reality. The legal system compounds this inequity. If residents attempt to challenge the placement of hazardous industries in their neighborhoods, they face nearly insurmountable hurdles. Under U.S. civil rights law, to win an environmental racism case, plaintiffs must prove that decision-makers intended to discriminate based on race. Demonstrating explicit intent is extraordinarily difficult. The courts require a smoking gun, an email, memo, or statement explicitly linking policy decisions to racial bias. The result is a legal framework that allows systemic neglect to continue under the guise of neutrality, even when the outcomes are strikingly unequal: higher rates of respiratory illnesses, elevated cancer incidences, and contaminated water supplies. Courts are often powerless to act without direct proof of intent. The system, in effect, masks structural inequity as procedural legality, allowing a pattern of environmental injustice to persist without accountability. Consider the lived experience of families in these communities. Children grow up playing in yards adjacent to industrial facilities, inhaling pollutants that can compromise lung development and exacerbate asthma. Adults commute to work through streets lined with hazardous emissions, their daily exposure cumulative and unavoidable. Pregnant women face elevated risks for complications, and the elderly are especially vulnerable to chronic illnesses intensified by environmental toxins. These health outcomes are not merely statistics. They represent real suffering, shortened lifespans, and intergenerational trauma. Generations of families have endured disproportionate health burdens because systemic decisions zoning, industrial placement, and underinvestment were made with a calculus that devalued their communities. This is a contemporary echo of Jim Crow's logic. Structural barriers and differential treatment persist, not necessarily through overt legal codes, but through institutional inertia and bureaucratic discretion that reproduces inequity. The connections to broader patterns of structural disadvantage are undeniable. Communities facing environmental neglect often intersect with areas affected by underfunded schools, limited healthcare resources, and concentrated poverty. Children attending schools in these neighborhoods may be exposed to pollutants that impair cognitive development and learning outcomes, compounding the educational disparities we have discussed. Families relying on local hospitals experience the compounded effects of both health inequity and environmental risk. The same neighborhoods targeted by industrial placement are often the ones subjected to heightened policing, biased traffic enforcement, and limited political representation, creating a web of disadvantage that spans housing, health, education, and governance. In other words, environmental injustice does not exist in isolation. It interacts with the broader ecosystem of structural inequity to systematically constrain opportunity and well-being. Real-life stories underscore the human cost. In one southern city, residents living near a chemical plant have long reported foul odors, contaminated soil, and increased respiratory issues. Despite repeated complaints, regulatory agencies cited procedural loopholes and insufficient proof of discriminatory intent, leaving families to cope with the consequences on their own. In another example, a historically black neighborhood adjacent to an oil refinery experienced elevated rates of cancer. Yet lawsuits were dismissed due to the impossibility of demonstrating that the refinery's placement was racially motivated rather than economically expedient. These narratives highlight a painful reality. Systemic environmental neglect often operates invisibly, its impact magnified by the legal requirement to prove intent rather than address outcomes. The historical roots of these patterns are unmistakable. During the segregation era, zoning laws were explicitly employed to separate black and white communities, not only in housing but in access to infrastructure, public services, and industrial development. Post-segregation, these policies have evolved in form but not always in function. Hazardous industries continue to be concentrated in black neighborhoods, guided by land values, political influence, and historical precedent. This creates what scholars term environmental redlining, a practice in which communities with limited economic or political clout are disproportionately exposed to environmental hazards. Just as property laws, jury selection, and policing patterns have evolved from Jim Crow-era mechanisms, environmental disparities represent another iteration of structural inequity, persistent yet often invisible to those not directly affected. The cumulative effect of environmental neglect extends beyond immediate health risks. It shapes the socioeconomic trajectory of communities, influencing property values, local business development, and long-term wealth accumulation. Families living in contaminated areas may struggle to sell homes or secure mortgages, perpetuating cycles of economic marginalization. Children growing up in these environments face higher barriers to academic achievement and social mobility, reinforcing intergenerational disparities. In essence, environmental inequity functions as both a symptom and a mechanism of structural racism, a force that continues to shape life outcomes decades after the formal end of segregation. Recognizing the scale and complexity of this issue is essential for meaningful change. Addressing environmental disparities requires more than isolated interventions. It demands systemic reforms in zoning, industrial regulation, public health investment, and legal standards for accountability. The legacy of Jim Crow teaches that inequity is rarely eradicated through single legislative acts. It is embedded in institutions, procedures, and societal expectations. By understanding how environmental injustice interacts with healthcare inequities, educational disparities, and political disenfranchisement, we gain a holistic picture of structural racism in America. Ultimately, the concentration of hazardous industries in historically black neighborhoods is a stark reminder that structural inequity is not merely a relic of the past. It persists in forms that are subtle, legalistically neutral, and deeply consequential, affecting health, wealth, and opportunity across generations. The challenge lies not only in recognizing these patterns, but in mobilizing systemic solutions that prioritize equity, accountability, and the protection of communities long subjected to invisible but enduring harms. The story of environmental neglect is inseparable from the broader narrative of structural racism, and confronting it is essential for realizing a more just and equitable society. As we draw this exploration to a close, it is crucial to recognize that the legacy of segregation-era policies is not confined to distant history books. It actively shapes the educational and economic realities of millions today. One of the most insidious mechanisms perpetuating this inequity is the way public schools are funded through property taxes. On the surface, this system appears neutral. Wealthier neighborhoods contribute more to their local schools, poorer neighborhoods less. Yet beneath this veneer of fairness lies a stark reality. Neighborhoods historically subjected to redlining, discriminatory lending, and limited economic investment, primarily black communities, remain under-resourced. Their schools lack the funding necessary for modern textbooks, up-to-date technology, extracurricular programs, and competitive teacher salaries. Class sizes are larger, support staff are limited, and students are deprived of opportunities that their peers in wealthier districts take for granted. The cycle is self-perpetuating. Underfunded schools produce underprepared graduates, who then face constrained career prospects, limited access to higher education, and lower lifetime earnings, reinforcing generational disparities that began decades ago. Digital redlining is a newer, yet equally powerful, iteration of this structural inequity. Just as physical infrastructure was denied to black neighborhoods under Jim Crow, access to essential digital resources, broadband internet, high-speed connections, and affordable technology is now unevenly distributed. Entire neighborhoods are effectively excluded from the digital economy, leaving students unable to complete homework, families unable to participate fully in remote work, and residents barred from online services that increasingly dictate economic mobility. These disparities are not the result of random oversight. They reflect long-standing patterns of underinvestment, zoning decisions, and economic neglect, now translated into the digital age. The consequence is a modern form of segregation. Educational and economic opportunity is contingent on zip codes, mirroring the inequities of the past under a guise of technological neutrality. This interconnected web of structural disadvantage, from property tax funding to digital access, illustrates how systemic inequity adapts and persists. It is a direct descendant of the same logic that once enforced separate but equal laws, manipulated political representation through prison gerrymandering, and skewed legal outcomes through biased jury selection. Today, black communities are still contending with the repercussions. Wealth lost through land dispossession, lives endangered by underfunded healthcare systems, education constrained by inequitable school funding, and opportunities curtailed by digital exclusion. Each of these factors alone might seem manageable, but taken together, they form a pervasive system that quietly reinforces inequality, normalizing what appears to be neutral policy while producing profoundly unequal outcomes. Real stories make this systemic issue tangible. Imagine a student trying to complete a crucial science project at home but lacking reliable internet. Their school, underfunded due to low property tax revenue, cannot provide the necessary technology. Meanwhile, A family trying to start a small business faces the same digital barriers, limiting access to markets, resources, and financial services that wealthier communities take for granted. These everyday obstacles accumulate, compounding over time to define life outcomes before children even have the chance to choose their paths. The digital divide, like underfunded schools, is not merely a technical issue. It is a matter of civil and economic rights, a contemporary mechanism for perpetuating the inequalities embedded in American society for generations. The broader lesson is clear. Systemic inequity thrives when society allows historical disadvantages to calcify into institutional practice. When funding formulas, zoning decisions, and access to technology are left unexamined, the past continues to dictate the present, and opportunities for true equality remain out of reach. Yet, awareness of these patterns is the first step toward change. By recognizing the structural forces at play, communities, policymakers, and advocates can intervene to design solutions that redistribute resources equitably, dismantle digital barriers, and provide all students, not just those in affluent neighborhoods, with the tools they need to thrive. Equity in education is not just a moral imperative, it is an economic and social necessity, ensuring that all citizens can participate fully in society and contribute to its collective progress. As we reflect on the story we have traced from the lingering echoes of Jim Crow to modern manifestations in schools, hospitals, courts, and digital infrastructure, it becomes clear that structural racism is not merely historical. It is living, evolving, and often invisible to those who do not experience it directly. The policies, practices, and economic mechanisms that were once explicit have now been refined, rebranded, and embedded within the structures of everyday life. But understanding these connections empowers us to act, to advocate for fair funding, equitable healthcare, unbiased legal systems, responsible urban planning, and inclusive access to technology. Change is possible when we illuminate the mechanisms of inequity and refuse to accept the status quo as immutable. Thank you for taking the time to engage with this story. If this video has helped you understand the complex legacy of structural inequity and its ongoing impact, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who care about justice, fairness, and systemic change. Your engagement ensures that these critical conversations reach more people, helping to build awareness and collective action for a more equitable future. Every click, comment, and subscription amplifies the message that equality cannot wait, and that history's lessons must guide our present.